Good afternoon. My name is Johanna Hartwig, and I am the Executive Director of the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society. Try saying that a few times fast. I am so delighted to welcome you, everyone who's in this nice crowded room, and I know there are many people who are going to be joining us online for our program, Justice in Fearful Times, Law and the Red Scares in Washington State. The Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society is a 40-year-old nonprofit with the mission of sharing and preserving the history of the law within the Ninth Circuit, a very large area, as you all know, and also raising awareness of the critical role that the judicial branch plays in our society. Today's program is the kickoff for the society of a series that we are planning around the circuit of local stories of the Red Scares within particular areas. And we are really thrilled to have Judge Lasnik, Judge Downing, Jennifer Ott from History Link, and Julian Pritchard joining us here today. You can find out more about the Historical Society online. We have panels and programs, we have a wonderful journal, and we also take oral histories of judges and attorneys around the circuit. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, as always, to Judge Lasnik, who will be helping moderate this panel. Judge Lasnik is one of our glorious board members. We so appreciate his service. And now I would like to turn it over to Nicole Battles.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Battles, and I'm here with Protect Our Judges, one of the co-sponsors of today's event. Protect Our Judges is a new nonprofit that was formed earlier this year. We are a nonpartisan organization that's dedicated to building public awareness and support for an independent judiciary through media campaigns and public education. We have our launch event coming up on June 22nd. We hope to see all of you there. It's going to be at the Washington Athletic Club from 5 to 7. You can find out more information about Protect Our Judges, the event, and the other things that we're working on at protectourjudges.com. Thank you. Cynthia.
Thank you, Nicole, and good afternoon. So on behalf of the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society, Protect Our Judges, and the M. Margaret McEwen Federal Bar Association, we welcome you to today's event. So this afternoon's discussion will explore the waves of anti-communist fear that shaped the United States and some of the courts what they had to grapple with between the two world wars. So for judges and lawyers, these issues are more than historical. Many of our era's defining conflicts unfolded in courtrooms, and that's where members of the bench and the bar were called upon to navigate these issues. So today, as the chair of programs for the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society, I am really pleased and honored to welcome this amazing panel. And just a note of pride that Judge Lasnik actually sits on the board also of the NJCHS with us, and we're really happy to have that talent on board. So starting with our moderator, Judge Robert Lasnik, he has had, as most of you in the room know, a distinguished judicial career. And today he brings deep insight into the constitutional law and the role of the courts during the political pressure of these times. Judge William Downing comes to us. He was a longtime King County Superior Court judge. He is now retired and is in mediation. He's widely respected for his long-standing service on the bench and his thoughtful engagement in legal history and civic education. Then we're joined by historian Jennifer Ott of History Link, who I can also call a very good friend, and our combination of efforts for Volunteer Park and Volunteer Park Trust is how we met. Her work is on Seattle and the Pacific Northwest history. She has lots of publications out there and has illuminated the local dimension of political movements and social change. And finally, we have Julian Pritchard of MOHI, that's the Museum of History and Industry. And Julian, as it happens, had recently published an article with HistoryLink on this very topic. And so thank you for being here, Julian. So together, our panelists will help us examine not only what happened during the Red Scare, but also those events and what they reveal about enduring responsibilities of judges and lawyers. And so with that, please help me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Cynthia, and welcome to all of you here today. We have some of my colleagues, Jim Robard, Richard Jones, I saw walk in, but I also want to acknowledge somebody who I've been associated with for 45 years. You know, I represent the executive branch from being in the prosecutor's office and the judicial branch in state government. Mary Kay Becker represents the legislative branch. She was a longtime representative from Whatcom County and the judicial branch from Division I Court of Appeals in Seattle and Western Washington. So it's great to have that kind of audience along with many lawyers and other interested people. You know, Judge Downing and I, if you grew up in the 1950s like we did, the Red Scare was a big part of everything you came across. I remember as a kid, I was a huge New York Giants baseball fan, and I would read the New York Daily News, and they had a columnist, Dick Young, who would always talk about better dead than red. What that had to do with sports, I don't know, but I was fascinated. What does that mean? And my parents said, well, some people would rather be dead than be communists. And it's so important, Bobby, in the 1950s that you not be associated with the Reds. And I said, I don't root for the Reds, I root for the Giants. But to show you how manic the country was, the Cincinnati Reds had to change their name to the Cincinnati Red Legs, like the Boston Red Sox, because you didn't want to be called a Red in those days. And I'm telling you, we can look back on that now and think, boy, that was really weird, but it was definitely a mindset for that time. Now, later on, when I introduce you to Judge Downing, keep in mind that in the 60s, he had long hair and a mustache. He rode a motorcycle. He was a diversity, equity, inclusion person at Vassar College, breaking the gender gap as one of the first boys to be allowed in there. He was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and he attended the rock festival at Woodstock. Any one of those things would have made you a communist in those days, and he got right on through the whole. So you can take what he says with a large grain of salt. But first, we're going to start with one of our historians, Jennifer Ott, who has put together a PowerPoint to talk about the different phases of Red Scares. One which happened around the time of the Russian Revolution in the 19-teens, and the labor movement in the Northwest, known as International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. And then a second one, which we associate with after World War II, when our ally, the Soviet Union, became our adversary, and we had issues involving China going communist, the Korean War, the McCarthy committees, and in Washington State, the Canwell Committee. So I turn it over first to one of our historians, Jennifer Ott.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us here. One of my favorite parts about my job is that I get to get out into the wild with the history, and I do love it. So I'm going to do a quick presentation here just to give an overview, and it's just 13 minutes, and so I'm going to glide over some pretty quick facts just to give you this, set the stage for our conversation today. So many people are familiar with McCarthyism and the anti-communist hysteria it represents, but not as many are aware that there were two Red Scares, two periods in our country's history when fear rooted in real national security threats were propelled by astute manipulation of public sentiment into absurd infringements on First Amendment rights. Likewise, the national story is more commonly known than the regional story here in Washington and the Northwest. That story unfolded in the context of our long history of radical movements, utopian experiments, labor organizing, anarchists, and strikes, many of which had violent episodes. Over time, the Northwest has become known as the left coast, and references like they are all red out there and the Soviet of Washington were not uncommon. Still not in some ways. This reputation was fueled by myriad streams of radicalism. Some were brought over from immigrants' home countries. Others came out of the brutal working conditions in the mines, forests, waterfronts, farms, and railroads, and ships. Pay was low and danger was high. Starting with the first Red Scare, we can see a swell of anti-immigrant and anti-communist sentiment during the First World War, which comes to a head in the immediate post-war years. The immediate trigger was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, which toppled the provisional government in place after the overthrow of the Tsar. The provisional government was celebrated by the United States as a pro-democracy movement. When the Bolsheviks ousted the provisional government's leaders, Americans feared that they would make a separate peace with Germany and thus free up the German troops fighting on the Eastern Front to shift to the Western Front, where the European nations were trying to hold them back. The Bolsheviks wanted to end the war because of the horrific impact of the fighting on Russians. This internal concern was interpreted by Americans as pro-German sympathies. Subsequently, anyone in the United States who supported the Bolsheviks was tarred as a German sympathizer at a time when the United States was at war with Germany and the other Axis countries. The concern about German sympathizers was heightened by the Zimmermann telegram, which indicated the Germans were seeking an alliance with Mexico against the US, and the possibility of an attack from within or without seemed very high. The Red Scare was not all in response to abstract ideas or to things happening overseas. There was also evidence of efforts to undermine national security and the American way of life. Across the country, strikes, often violent. These are some newspapers. And I thought since we were going to be talking a lot about newspaper publishers today, that I would use a lot of newspaper headlines to give you a sense of how much that bold type really jumps out at you. And so, sorry, lost my place. And the strikes broke out in industries that were important to the war effort, like mining and agriculture, and here in Washington in the timber industry, which was essential to making the airplanes. The Spruce Division eventually was brought in to break the strikes and get that industry rolling. In 1919, dozens of this is a great coal strike image where they are seeing how the coal strike is going to crush the community. But there were also bomb plots, and they were real. In May Day 1919, dozens of bombs were sent in order to arrive at public figures' homes and offices. And in September of 1920, a bomb was rigged up in a wagon and put on Wall Street. And when it exploded, it killed 30 people and injured hundreds. And we sort of hear about these events in history and we think, oh, there was a bomb, people died. It sort of gets chalked up as just an event on the timeline. But imagine this happening today. This would be quite terrifying if somebody rolled a bomb into Wall Street and let it off. And so there was, in fact, a war going on, and there were many people who were pro-Russian and anti-war. Congress passed the Espionage Act in June 1917. It made it a crime to obstruct the draft or encourage disloyalty. The most objectionable provision of the law for most Americans was the power it gave to the Postmaster General to determine if mailed items violated the act and declare them unmailable, which posed a significant threat to First Amendment rights. I mean, it's just when you read it, you think, I don't think we should give one person the right to choose that. The law was also used to jail labor leaders, including perennial presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs and Big Bill Haywood of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was also known as the IWW or the Wobblies. In January 1918, Congress went a step further with the Sedition Act, which set penalties for speaking against the American government, Constitution, flag, uniform, interfering with wartime production, which meant strikes, promoting the causes of our enemies, inciting people to refuse military service, or obstructing military recruitment, either by direct action or by advocating for others to take direct action. It also broadened the restrictions on what was mailable. These laws were were measured responses to the perceived communist threat compared to some public reaction. In Hammond, Indiana, sorry, I'm one slide off, I'm gonna go back. In Hammond, Indiana, a man killed an immigrant who yelled, "To hell with the United States," and a jury acquitted the murderer after just 2 minutes of deliberation. At a victory pageant in Washington, D.C., a sailor shot a man who refused to stand for the Star-Spangled Banner, and the crowd around them clapped and cheered. In Waterbury, Connecticut, a store clerk got 6 months in jail because he described Lenin as the brainiest of the Russian revolutionaries. And so hysteria seems to barely touch what was going on. We all live through crazy times, but I can hardly imagine living where this was in the news. Locally, the members of one Pierce County Utopian Society, which was the Home Colony, which was an anarchist society, they rejected capitalism in favor of various degrees of socialism, communism, and anarchy. The members of the Home Colony sent anarchist newspapers through the mails, and so they were targeted, and their press was put out of business numerous times. But the populist and the progressive movements both flourished here, as did, sorry, this is the Home Colony. These are the residents. It was on the Key Peninsula across from Tacoma, and that was their newspaper, The Agitator. The most radical of the unions was the IWW, the Wobblies, and they wanted to unite workers across industries into one big union and abolish the wage labor system. So that was right in their preamble. And this, even for the labor movement in Washington, this is to the left. This is a radical movement. They are looking, prior unions had primarily focused on organizing people within crafts or within skills. And the IWW wants to bring everyone that's a worker together in opposition to the merchant class and the capitalists. And so they had varying degrees of success. Some people shied away from them and didn't really want to take that radical of a step, or they had sort of pride of craft and wanted to stay in their own unions. But in 1919 in Seattle, there was a shipyard strike that started at Skinner and Eddy, which is down about where Pier 46 is today. And it quickly grew into a general strike, one of the few that's happened in the United States. And it was successfully called, it was successfully operated. People provided their own, they fed each other. The certain key things like electricity and human services were kept in operation, but they shut the city down otherwise. And the leadership of the city was not happy. This is Mayor Ole Hansen, who would himself be actually one of the recipients of one of the bombs that were mailed. And he was a popular Seattle mayor. He immediately said he was going to call for martial law, which is not actually within his ability, but he was very angry. And he also called on the militia. And so there were troops in the streets of Seattle during this strike. It ended up ending without a lot of impact. Lots of historians like to argue, was it a failure or was it just as good as you might hope? Like, that's a big lift to do a general strike and have revolutionary change follow. But I think it's an interesting study in the unity and the strength of the movement here. Not all incidents here, though, ended peacefully. This was the Everett massacre. The Wobblies organizers got on a ship and sailed north to Everett in 1916. And when they arrived at the dock, the local police met them with gunfire, and 5 of them were killed. These are the death masks of the 5 that were killed. And that was a low point in the organizing for the Wobblies. And you see it, I was just talking to somebody earlier about the efforts of the Wobblies to organize the agricultural workers. And things like this made it very hard for them to organize, because when you realize how swift and sure the reaction is going to be, people shied away. Oops, I'm sorry. And then in 1919, during the Armistice Day parade in Centralia, we have what is variously known as the Centralia Massacre or the Centralia Tragedy. Kind of depends on which side of the argument you fall upon. And what happened is during the Armistice Day parade, the veterans that were marching in the parade, their leaders stopped them in front of the IWW hall and had them raid the hall right in the middle of the parade. But the IWW members were ready for it. They had been tipped off, and so they had guns, and they killed 3 of the veterans. One of the IWW members took off running, realizing, he needed to get away. The mob caught up with him, and they lynched him on a bridge outside of town. And so several WABI members were arrested for the killing of the veterans, and the process played out through the court. But it really brought home that during a small town parade, people would actually come to shooting. Let's see. The first Red Scare abated in the early 20s. Warren Harding ran for president in 1920, and his campaign was a return to normalcy. That always sticks with me because my teacher, when I learned it, hated that he'd made up a word, but it's a word that works. And so the US settled into the prosperity of the 20s. As there is more prosperity, it's harder to organize workers because there's less of a friction going on. And so, but they did continue to organize. The IWW and other labor organizers continue to work through the 20s for various improvements in the workers' conditions. But then after World War II, we have a second Red Scare erupt, and it's partly because the Russians get the bomb in 1949. It's partly because the Chinese communists take over the country there in 1949. And you just have a fear that communism will continue to spread around the globe, that it's not going to be contained to those immediate post-war countries. And so, like the first Red Scare, there were some legitimate concerns around espionage and communist influence in the United States. This is the Rosenbergs and Alger Hiss. Those cases really made people realize that there were people likely in the United States that were infiltrating the government. That's always hard to balance, that we know they were likely there and there's evidence of it, but that doesn't mean that what McCarthy was doing was a legitimate communist hunt. And so one of the legacies of the Depression is that a lot of people had joined or at least attended meetings of the Communist Party. And so as you come into the post-World War II Red Scare, you have a lot of people that are actually, there is a tether, there is a tie that you can tie between them and the Communist Party. And but then also in 1946, the Republicans regained control of Congress for the first time since 1932. And so they finally had the opportunity to roll back some of those New Deal programs that they felt were communist or socialist in nature. And they wanted to draw public policies and programs back to a more capitalist basis. And so McCarthyism is often used as shorthand for this era and for the Red Scare. But his House Un-American Activities Committee was not the first sign of the heightened fear of communism. In 1947, Truman announced the Loyalty Order, which authorized the FBI to investigate people and call them before loyalty boards. 5 million government employees were reviewed, hundreds were dismissed, and thousands resigned. The House Un-American Activities Committee itself had been a temporary committee investigating communist infiltration in the government since 1938. McCarthy was named it was a temporary committee and it became a standing committee in 1946, a permanent one. And McCarthy was named its chair and proceeded to terrorize government employees, people in the entertainment industry, and people across all walks of life. He wouldn't be stopped until after he went after members of the military and that famous "have you no decency" quote. He was censured in 1954 and died not long after. And the hysteria then waned. Once you didn't have one focal person fomenting this constant fear, it began to wane. In Washington, the egg and timber industries were hit especially hard by the Depression. Some unemployed workers turned toward more radical philosophies, including communism, in their search for relief and solutions for the future. Less dramatic than the 1910s, but leaders like Harry Bridges of the ILWU, the organizers of the Washington Pension Union, and other unions fought for workers' rights and economic security. The ILWU, which is the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, led by Harry Bridges, was particularly effective. They had had a strike in 1919 that was pretty much a dismal failure and really set the union back. And it was in that Red Scare era, it was just a really hard time to have a successful union. But in 1934, they had a very successful strike. They had learned their lesson. They did a cross industry on the waterfront strike. They integrated the union. They did all the things that had strengthened them where they had been weakened before. And so they got better wages, they got control of the hiring process. So no more just showing up at the dock and hoping for work. And also they got closed shops. And so waterfront shipping was union labor only. The union had fought for decades, all the way back to the 1880s in Seattle for those goals. The backlash here took a similar form to the national story. Republicans took control of the state legislature in the 1946 election. In 1947, a resolution was passed by the House and Senate creating the Legislative Joint Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities in Washington State, otherwise known as the Canwell Committee. It's quite a mouthful. It would be known as that because it was chaired by the newly elected Spokane Representative Albert Canwell. His mandate from the state legislature was to investigate, ascertain, collate, and appraise all facts concerning individuals, groups, or organizations whose activities are such as to indicate a purpose to foment internal strife, discord, and dissension, infiltrate and undermine the stability of our American institutions, confuse and mislead the people, and impede the normal progress of our state and nation, either in a wartime or a peacetime economy. While this has a veneer of sensibility, it would soon reveal its foundation in hysteria. In March 1948, a state senator, who I think his last name is pronounced Thomas Bayens, also from Spokane, spoke at the Spokane Realty Board's luncheon and claimed there were 5 million communists in the US. And the quote in the paper said that there are more than there were in Russia when they took over that country. He also said that Stalin intends to conquer the world and the United States. Are we going to heed the warning this time? And so he set the stage for the Canwell Committee. And so the committee went after the Washington Pension Union first. This organization was dedicated to getting a reasonable pension for elderly people, something they could actually live on. And the Canwell Committee went after it as too radical. The committee then called Harry Bridges to appear. And Harry Bridges was from Australia, so he's a naturalized citizen. He was long suspected of being a communist. He most likely was a member of the party, but over and over again, just not the Canwell Committee, multiple entities would try and deport him for his communist connections. He always outsmarted them, and he lived here. He was the union president all the way through the 60s. He was quite an amazing leader. In July 1948, the committee called 11 professors from the University of Washington to appear. Earlier, Canwell had alleged that there were at least 150 Communist Party members or sympathizers on the faculty, but they only called 11 to show up for the hearings. The hearings were at the Armory building, which is now the Center House at the Seattle Center. And the hearings were completely unfair. All of you in this room will absolutely appreciate this. The accused could not question the witnesses. And they could not challenge the committee members directly on the charges that they were being called before them for. They had basically no due process. Hundreds of protesters protested outside of the Armory building. And in the end, it was a long process that I can't go into, but it's quite interesting if you're interested in this, how it unfolded. But 3 professors were dismissed. And also 3 founders of the Seattle Repertory Theater, which was adjacent to the campus and pretty well connected with it. They were fined and sentenced to jail for refusing to answer questions from the committee. And so in 1967, Harvard professor Vern Countryman would write, "The activities of the Canwell Committee and its allies are clearly more subversive of established legal processes than any activities disclosed by the committee's investigation. In 1994, UW's President Gerberdine issued an apology to those who were dismissed. Though the Canwell Committee was ineffectual and soon disbanded, its impact would be felt outside of Washington. The legislative resolution establishing the commission was used throughout the country by other states to establish their own commissions to have on American activities. So anti-communist hysteria in Washington was not limited to the legislature. The Seattle Seven, which is not the Seattle Seven, you might be thinking, this is the Smith Act, Seattle Seven, were charged by the Justice Department in 1952 for conspiring to overthrow the government. 6 were convicted, fined, and sentenced to serve time, but the decision was overturned on appeal in 1958. Sadly, the head of the Washington Pension Union, William Pennock, took his own life during the case. That is why he was not convicted. Although the Red Scares faded, being labeled a communist could be disastrous for public figures for years following the height of the hysteria. It doesn't carry the same level of stigma today, just like you were saying, but it ruined careers and lives. The 3 people we're going to talk about today were all labeled communists in the newspapers with serious consequences. The first, Charles Fisher, was a president at Western Washington. I'm not going to get the name right. Julian will share the correct name at that moment in time. It had quite a journey to its current name. He was targeted by the Bellington Herald in the 1930s. The second story we'll hear about is Jim Ellis, who many of you may be familiar with. One of his first projects was cleaning up Lake Washington in the 1950s, and he drew sharp criticism from ways, but he was charged with being a communist by one newspaper editor. And then the last person we'll talk about is the only one of the 3 to seek legal remedy. John Goldmark lost his 1962 re-election campaign for his 4th term as a state representative, largely due to a smear campaign led by Albert Canwell, yes, that Canwell, and Ashley Holden, editor of the Tonasket Tribune. And so we will start with Julian, or pass it back to Judge Lesnick.
So Julian doesn't look old enough to be a historian, but he is. And he's going to tell us about what happened at the predecessor of Western Washington, before Western Washington became Western Abnormal Washington University. It was known as Western Normal, or just Normal. And he will tell us what happened there in the 1930s. Julian?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, thank you, Judge Lesnick. Thank you, Jennifer. That was really great. Thank you to the 9th Judicial Circuit Court Historical Society for having me. In 1939, Charles H. Fisher, the 4th president of Western Washington College of Education, now Western Washington University, was removed from his post for political reasons by Washington State's conservative governor, Clarence Martin. Martin was actually a Democrat, but he was a conservative Democrat. Okay. This followed a years-long campaign by right-wing red-baiting Bellingham Herald editor, Frank I. Seifert. In 1935, a group of Bellingham business and civic leaders, led by Seifert, known as the Committee on Normal Protest, held a secret trial of Fisher in front of the school's 3 trustees, presenting their charges against the president. These charges included a lack of patriotism, the alleged invitation of known radicals and pacifists to campus, support for, quote, free love and atheism, and other supposedly subversive activities. This turn of events raises numerous questions. Was Fisher really a communist or communist sympathizer? What caused such enmity between Fisher and Seifert? How did this small town in Northwest Washington become so politically polarized? Who were the members of the Committee on Normal Protest? To answer these questions, we must first understand the local, national, and international context. In 1917, with the world at war, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. In the United States, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 were enacted, essentially criminalizing speech critical of the US government or the war effort. Famous socialist Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to prison in 1918 for speaking out against conscription. In 1919, a series of anarchist mail bombings, including one sent to the house of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, led to a wave of state repression and deportations known as the Palmer Raids. On February 6, 1919, 65,000 Seattle workers rose up in a general strike. furthering Washington's reputation as a hotbed of radicalism, after earlier violent clashes involving the radical industrial workers of the world in Centralia and Everett. Overall, this first Red Scare targeted immigrants, anti-war activists, and labor radicals. On a local level in Bellingham, the interwar era was largely conservative. The Klan marched openly throughout the 1920s, with local newspapers reporting a, quote, mile-long march of over 700 Klansmen in 1926. This included high-ranking members of Bellingham's local government and business leaders. In the 1930s, a pro-fascist group known as the Silver Legion was active in Bellingham, publicly sympathizing with Nazi Germany. While the historical era commonly referred to as McCarthyism or the Second Red Scare wouldn't start until the early 1950s, smaller scale acts of anti-communist hysteria and repression in the interwar period have been deemed little red scares by the historian Robert Justin Goldstein. Though they lacked mainstream political power, far-right organizations claimed that FDR's New Deal was communist and claimed to see Soviet infiltration in government, the media, schools, labor unions, and civil society. These America First isolationists opposed US intervention in World War II and claimed that the Soviets, not the Nazis, were the real enemy. The Great Depression, beginning with the stock market crash in October 1929, raised widespread doubts about the viability of the capitalist system as a whole, and some leftists saw the Soviet model as a possible alternative. Even liberals realized that dealing with this extent of economic despair would require some level of state intervention. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, with his ambitious New Deal programs providing relief to the unemployed. Groups like the Unemployed Citizens League formed in Seattle to push local government to the left. The New Deal coalition swept Democrats to power in Washington state, reflecting a major national political realignment. These progressive changes led conservatives to mobilize against the New Deal and portray it as socialism. One famous right-wing activist from this era was Elizabeth Dilling, born in Chicago in 1894. In 1934, Dilling self-published the book, The Red Network, a who's who and handbook of radicalism for patriots, which purportedly contained a list of over 1,000 communists and organizations in the US. A fervent anti-Semite, Dilling referred to the New Deal as the Jew Deal and blamed Jews for the spread of communism. In his crusade against Fisher, Seifert relied on the Red Network to identify supposed communists invited to Western. In this context of fervent anti-communism, let's now return to Fisher and Seifert. Charles Henry Fisher was born in York County, Pennsylvania in 1880, and he earned a master's in education in 1915. He taught in various educational institutions for years before becoming president of Bellingham Normal School in 1923. Upon assuming his role as president, Fisher carried out wide-ranging reforms of the Normal School, expanding its campus, professionalizing its staff, and earning national recognition in spite of the Great Depression. By 1933, Bellingham Normal School was authorized by Washington legislature to grant Bachelors of the Arts degrees in education. Far from being a socialist or communist, Fisher was a New Deal liberal who supported academic freedom. Yet not everyone in Bellingham appreciated Fisher's outspoken political views. He was known to get into heated arguments with local conservatives. Born in 1867 in Indiana, Frank Iris Everett earned a reputation as a right-wing firebrand who did not hesitate to use the newspaper he edited to attack his enemies, real or perceived. Beginning his journalism career at the age of 12, Seifert practiced his craft at a time when sensationalism and distortion of facts was more or less the norm. In 1911, he arrived in Bellingham, where he became manager and editor of the Bellingham Herald. Seifert quickly became involved in local politics, using his position of power to promote Republican and conservative causes. Seifert identified with newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, who also carried out a national right-wing campaign against educators, even referring to himself as Little Hearst. It didn't take long for Seifert to set his sights on a liberal reformer like Charles Fisher. The Committee on Normal Protest first formed to begin their campaign against Fisher in 1934. To destroy Fisher, Seifert devised a plan. First, he would organize a committee to charge Fisher with a list of 10 abuses to try to get the school's trustees to fire Fisher. This would be a private hearing with a typist present, in which he would antagonize Fisher and red bait him with the intent of getting him to incriminate himself. If this failed to sway the trustees, Seifert would mail the transcript to the governor, along with other, quote, evidence collected by the Committee on Normal Protest. This hearing took place in the building now known as Old Main on May 22nd, 1935. Lasting nearly 5 hours, Seifert voiced his grievances against Fisher, attempting to link him to atheism and communism. Seifert claimed that alumni had lost faith in Fisher, that Fisher had sponsored or encouraged subversive speakers on campus, that the flag was seldom flown, that the student newspaper, The Viking, recommends books and magazines containing assaults upon the home and American social customs, and that decline in attendance is traceable in large measure to the loss of public faith in administration of the normal. Contrary to Seifert's allegations, decline in attendance was much more likely due to the economic downturn of the Great Depression. The charges of atheism were absurd considering that Fisher was himself a practicing Presbyterian and seminary graduate. Despite Seifert's efforts, the trustees unanimously backed Fisher, stating that they recognize in him an able and conscientious administrator. Nevertheless, the Committee on Normal Protest continued to lobby Governor Martin, sending him the letter with a package of evidence on May 30th, 1935. This evidence largely consisted of student newspaper clippings and lists of supposedly read books from the school library. In 1938, Martin met with the trustees, who agreed to fire Fisher. His removal prompted national debate on academic freedom, including an article in Time magazine. Staff and students at Western protested the removal of a popular university president, to no avail. On August 31st, 1939, Dr. William Wade Haggard became the next president of Western. The motives of the Committee on Normal Protest varied. Francis P. Larrabee, who owned mines in Washington and Montana, as well as railroad and real estate interests, may have been motivated by a student group inviting a speaker supportive of a labor strike at a Larrabee-owned mine in Roslyn, Washington. Though primarily known as a philanthropist and prominent socialite, Francis Larrabee founded the Bellingham chapter of a conservative women's group known as Pro-America, which was active in the anti-Fisher mobilization. Larrabee was also known to be close with Governor Martin. Other local groups in the Committee on Normal Protest included members of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Legion, the Bellingham Republican Party, some religious groups, and business organizations, motivated by opposition to the New Deal and its supposed association with communism. After his ousting in 1939, Fisher moved back to New York for a teaching job. By 1944, he returned to Washington to work with the state government, and then became president of the Washington Pension Union, which would be the first organization to be charged with subversion in 1948 by the Canwell Committee. Fisher and his sons lobbied state legislature to protect academic independence from state power, eventually resulting in a 1943 state law establishing for-cause dismissal of trustees and regents with a requirement for judicial review. As a result of his experience with Seifert's committee, Fisher became politicized, running unsuccessfully in 1950 as a left-wing Democrat in a congressional primary in Washington's 2nd District against noted Cold War hawk Henry M. Jackson on a pacifist platform. Needless to say, he lost with like 6% of the vote. Seifert died in 1950, leaving the Bellingham Herald to his sons. Since 1939, Seifert obsessively collected newspaper clippings related to Fisher's activities outside of Bellingham. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1950, and after his death, Seifert's friends successfully advocated for naming a mountain near Mount Baker in his honor. The public recognition of Seifert contrasts strikingly with the official silence from Western Washington University about Fisher, despite his positive transformation of the university. Fisher died in Seattle in 1964. In 1968, the fountain in Western Washington University's Red Square was dedicated to Fisher, with funds privately donated by nearly 300 of Fisher's colleagues, family, and friends. At its dedication ceremony, then President Charles Flora praised Fisher's commitment to free speech, while remaining vague about the specific nature of his removal. No evidence has ever emerged conclusively proving that Fisher was a communist, yet his career was permanently ruined by these baseless allegations. Ultimately, Fisher's case was a warning of the anti-communist witch hunts that would plague the United States in subsequent decades under HUAC and Cold War pressures. Educators who questioned prevailing ideas in American foreign or domestic policy were derided as unpatriotic or un-American, destroying thousands of careers throughout the 1950s. The decades of obfuscation surrounding Fisher's removal exemplify the tensions between political power, civil liberties, wealthy interests, and censorship at universities. Western students continue to use Fisher Fountain as a meeting place for protest and sometimes controversial free speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't want anyone to think that Tony Duck is a communist, but he seems to have found a way to post his photo up there. Two people who, one was mentioned, one hasn't been, with local ties. Vern Countryman University of Washington Law School, and very close to Justice William O. Douglas. And the person whose story about the McCarthy hearings and Joseph McCarthy may have led to his demise, Edward R. Murrow, grew up in Burlington and went to Washington State University. So two important people in setting the record straight. My great friend, co-counsel on murder trials, colleague together on the state court, Bill Downing, is going to address some of the legal issues now. Judge Downing?
Bob said I could do it from here. In deference to my age, I'm senior to him by a little bit.
No. Yeah.
Good.
Try again.
All right. Well, what I wanted to talk about is the
A little
portion
closer.
of the Red Scare that is in my life, that affected me. To me, and it was scary. It begins in elementary school. I remember in the mid-50s trooping downstairs to the fallout shelter in Martin Van Buren Elementary School. What I have to confess I do remember is in the storage area off the kitchen, these 5-gallon cans of succotash. And I looked at those and I said, I'll take my chances with the Ruskies. But the Red Scare then extended on through 9th grade. For me, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and sort of dissipated after that. But there was a constant drumbeat of the fear of the communists during that era, from elementary school on through the 9th grade. One thing that strikes me when I look back on all of this now and give it some thought with a little bit of distance is that in addition to the geopolitical implications of the anti-communist fears, there's a huge cultural element to the Red Scare that I think we can't lose sight of. We're not talking about governmental controls, McCarthy leading this posse against the rest of us, but we're talking about a lot of human nature, primal cultural feelings that involved anti-elitism, otherism. There are aspects where blacks and gays and foreigners obviously were targeted through all of this. And then there's basic old notion of not wanting to undercut American traditions of self-reliance and so on by ceding powers to a government, whether it's a global government or a local government. All these things, I think, combined to make it easy to direct distrust to not only the red Russian bear, but also anything that might be a little pink around the edges during that time frame. The non-governmental pressures coming from society, peer pressures, were so strong. Bob mentioned the Cincinnati Reds. He said having to change their name. Well, they didn't have to change their name because of any government telling them they had to. It was because of their perception of the community and what was good and bad for their business. They chose to change the name. The movies, the film industry was so directly impacted. There were American Legion troops that insisted on their right to view directors' cuts before films were released in the theater. And Treasure of the Sierra Madre had a big change made to it in terms of the way in which labor was glorified, simply because the use of the word labor was seen as being a contentious term to be using. Because of the cultural aspects to the Red Scare, I think that's why the Red Scare continued long after there was the geopolitical justification for its continuation. After Edward R. Murrow had blasted McCarthy after Eisenhower and Margaret Chase Smith had blasted McCarthy and other prominent Republicans. There was no need. Canwell was dead in the mid-50s. He served one term in the legislature from 46 to 48. He was thrown out in the fall of 48, the year in which he had conducted his hearings. And there really was not, the Communist Party also was self-destructing during this time. The American Communist Party was no longer the frightening entity that it had seemed to be a little bit earlier. So there wasn't a justification necessarily for the Red Scare to continue, and yet it did continue long after the mid-1950s. Some of the ways, among the ways that it continued is through the Smith Act prosecutions, the institutions of learning imposing loyalty oaths on professors and other employees, and then the smears for people like Jim Ellis and John Goldmark and others as well. So I want to go through just a few of the cases, not as a law school lecture, but to give just a flavor of the times and the way in which some of the issues that were raised actually came to be viewed because of the times. It wasn't illegal to be a communist in the 1940s. It hadn't been made illegal. And so what the government entities did was to bring charges under the Smith Act, which was a 1940 law that made it illegal to belong to any organization that advocated the overthrow of the US government by force or violence. It's kind of a stretch, really. But there were 11 members. The case, you know, the case, lawyers, United States versus Dennis. There were 11 members of the Communist Party who were charged under violation of the Smith Act. And the truth of the matter is that communist cells in those days would sit around and engage in basically teach-ins where they would talk about economic issues and discuss Marx and Engels and so on. But there was no actual act of violence or instigation to imminent violence. And so to prosecute these people really was kind of a stretch for the government. And the way they did it was by bringing out 100-year-old texts, things that were written and said by Marx and Engels that supported the argument of a violent overthrow of the government. They were summarily convicted at trial easily in the federal court in New York. Learned Hand wrote the opinion for the Second Circuit in 1950. And Judge Hand acknowledged that ordinarily we would be glad to let an unhappy, bitter outcast vent his venom before any crowds he can muster and in any terms that he wishes, be they as ferocious as he will. One may trust that his patent impotence will be a foil to anything he may propose. Yeah, that's the normal rule, he said, but then he quickly turns the page and says, here we're faced with something very different. The American Communist Party, of which the defendants are controlling spirits, is a highly articulated, well-contrived, far-spread organization numbering thousands of adherents, rigidly and ruthlessly disciplined, many of whom are infused with a passionate utopian faith that is to redeem mankind. It has its founder, its apostles, its sacred texts, perhaps even its martyrs. It seeks converts far and wide by an extensive system of schooling, demanding of all an inflexible doctrinal orthodoxy. So yeah, I have to think he's a little bit outside the record here and making some of these findings. But that's the view in the community. His conclusion then is obvious to him and his colleagues. Such a conspiracy creates a danger of the utmost gravity and of enough probability to justify its suppression. We hold that it is a danger clear and present, using Justice Holmes' test from the Schenck case in 1919, after the earlier Red Scare. The Supreme Court easily affirmed the conviction of these individuals in US versus Dennis, but I thought it was interesting that Hugo Black in dissent wrote, public opinion being what it is now, and this is in the early 50s, few will protest the conviction of these communist petitioners. There is hope, however, that in calmer times, when present pressures, passions, and fears subside, this or some later court will restore the First Amendment liberties to the high preferred place where they belong in a free society. Well, he was right. It happened, but it took a while. After the Dennis case had been affirmed by the US Supreme Court, all across the country, there were Smith Act prosecutions brought against local people. The FBI in Seattle raided the homes of 7 communist leaders here, and the Seattle 7 were charged and put on trial in the federal court down on the 4th Avenue in Seattle. Again, there was no evidence that any of these people had engaged in any violence. There was no evidence, direct evidence, that they had advocated violence, but they were all convicted based on their unindicted co-conspirators, Marx and Engels, and given the maximum 5 years in prison. Now, I feel like this is history, but I have to mention to Bob here and any others in the room for whom this might be true, the lawyers representing them at trial included C.T. Hatton and John Coughlin, who, when Bob and I were young prosecutors in the 70s, were still active in the local bar, and they represented the Seattle 7 back in 1952 when their trial took place in the federal courthouse. Case went up on appeal, of course, and the Ninth Circuit, getting a little bit soft maybe, said, well, let's hit the pause button and let these wait. We're waiting for the US Supreme Court to decide all of these cases from all jurisdictions all around the country and to set out some guidelines. So we'll just put this on pause. And it took 5 years before that happened, but the US Supreme Court in 1957 decided the case of Yates versus United States. And in this case, the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court, said teaching abstract ideas is not enough to support conviction under the Smith Act. There needs to be something more concrete in terms of the actual advocacy of force or violence to overthrow the government. I thought it was a little bit disingenuous when Justice Harlan wrote, in failing to distinguish between advocacy of forcible overthrow and an abstract document as an abstract doctrine and advocacy of actions to that end, the district court appears to have been led astray by the holding in Dennis that advocacy of violent action to be taken at some future time was enough. Well, when they wrote the earlier Dennis opinion, they're fine, go get these guys, get these communists off the street and do what you have to do. And so now he's chiding the district court for that. One thing that's kind of interesting, I think, and from what Ms. Ott was saying before, it started as 7, and then 1 died during the trial. There also was one other that fell by the wayside because Barbara Hartle was one of the defendants, and she, after the conviction, flipped and became a key witness then in the HUAC hearings that were conducted in Seattle in the mid 1950s. And so there were 4 of them left. I think 1 was acquitted at trial. So there were 4 left who were waiting and waiting and waiting for those 5 years before the US Supreme Court issued their ruling in the Yates case. Yates did not specifically rule the Smith Act unconstitutional. It limited its application in a way that made it virtually unenforceable. The Smith Act didn't really become history until 1969 in the Brandenburg versus Ohio case, when the court held that for provocative speech to be punishable, there has to be a likelihood of actually producing imminent legal activity. And obviously the Smith Act prosecutions of the communists were nowhere near any of that. The loyalty oath cases I want to talk about because there's a nice local angle on those as well. But the UW professors were all required to sign oaths to receive their faculty paychecks, meager as they were. Two of them brought action in state court in Seattle, seeking declaratory judgment. They got the declaratory judgment on at the trial court, but then lost it on appeal in front of the state Supreme Court. And here again, we've got some familiar names. The professors were represented by Solly Ringgold, and the Attorney General handling the case was Mike Alfieri. So not so long ago. The state Supreme Court quickly in the and this is 1959 by now, but this is after the Canwell hearings had taken place across the state of Washington. The state Supreme Court said, you know what, we disagree with the trial court. We think that there's nothing wrong with these loyalty oaths at all. The legislature approved all of this. The 1951 Act, says the court, was the result of the report of the Joint Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities in the state of Washington, otherwise referred to as the Canwell Committee. And so the opinion basically was exceedingly deferential to the legislative findings. And remember, these are legislative findings made at hearings at which there was no due process, where there was secret evidence, no right to confront the accuser, reliance upon hearsay, all sorts of things that render them highly suspect under any proper legal analysis. So the conclusion of the court was that the loyalty oaths are a valid exercise of the sovereign power of the state for the protection of the state of Washington and its existing educational institutions and their respective students. So we're protecting the students. And what are we protecting the students from? Well, they have an appendix to the Supreme Court ruling, state Supreme Court ruling, and in the appendix, they have lengthy excerpts from the Canwell Committee's report. That begins with the wonderful language: the state of Washington is a crawl with trained and iron disciplined communists who they get under your feet and all squishy. A crawl. They effectively operate and manipulate an incredible maze of propaganda outlets known as, all caps here, Communist Front organizations. I mean, it's classic conspiracy theory reeking through all of this. If the communists are permitted to work unhampered a short time more in American education, the significance of our historic background will be lost to a generation of Americans. I mean, we've got to act fast because we're a crawl. Every communist sympathizer is a potential saboteur and spy, and it is the rankest nonsense to finance this program of self-destruction with public funds. So the Washington court decision vacated, and Washington affirmed the use of the loyalty oaths, but that was vacated and remanded by the Supreme Court a little bit later on. The 1963, they were still imposing these loyalty oaths because it had been approved by the state Supreme Court. So this time, a number of professors came together and filed a class action in the federal courts in 1963, this challenging the loyalty oaths. They went in front of a three-judge panel at the federal courthouse here. The injunction was denied. It was found that there was no violation of the constitutional rights in requiring an oath that I am not a member of the Communist Party or any subversive or be terminated if you don't want to sign it. The three-judge panel referred back to the Nostrand case, the state Supreme Court ruling on the loyalty oaths of a few years earlier. But this time, the professors fared better when they took it up on appeal, because in 1964, under the name Baggett versus Bullitt, the U.S. Supreme Court flipped that ruling and said, no, it's unconstitutionally vague with all these references to who is a subversive person, for instance, or what does it mean to aid someone who is a member of this party or who might be a subversive person. You're aiding them in crossing the street, aiding them by doing them some sort of favor, whatever it might be. lawyer representing a Communist Party or its members, a journalist defending constitutional rights, and so on. So found it to be unconstitutionally vague. And this was, this was ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, 1964, we've gotten now past that Cuban Missile Crisis, and time is marching on. Kind of funny, Clark and Harlan in dissent in that case said, it is strange that the court should find the language of this statute so profoundly vague when in the past we've approved it. For instance, in the Dennis case, those Smith Act cases, say, well, yeah, you got a point there. But it's like the Japanese internment cases. Time marches on. And I think once, once the fever has broken, and once there's a little bit of perspective of time, things can be viewed a little differently. And in this instance, the respect for the civil liberties were restored to their place where they properly belonged.
So Judge Downing, you're sort of putting the end to the Red Scare and things to worry about, but
Yeah.
here in 2026, we don't have loyalty oaths, but we have certain law firms being put on a do not allow into federal buildings list. We have certain universities being accused of establishing doctrine for admissions or for teaching that are improper. And we're seeing some of the same things, aren't we?
We are, and that's why we look to the courts to make sure that those civil liberties are retain that position that we want them to be in. I don't know that there's a fever today akin to the fever that swept the country with the Red Scare. I hope not.
And Ms. Ott, as a historian, do you see some parallels in this time that make you recognize some of the same patterns?
I do. The thing that jumps out at me the most is the potency of labels, and that it can become a shorthand for something that people are vaguely afraid of, even if they can't exactly articulate what they're afraid of always. And it's so hard to fight against those labels that you can be tarred and feathered and you really have no recourse.
And Julian Pritchard, what, from your perspective as a person in their 20s, how do you look at this from a historian and a youthful perspective?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think, of course, the Red Scare ended. I think you saw something kind of similar in with the War on Terror that kind of replaced, anti-communism as a, U.S. Imperative that kind of shaped the suspicion of a lot of people, maybe without evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was still young then, but
Still young in 2001.
Not scoring any points. And, what Judge Downing was talking about us starting in the 1970s, I should point out, when we started going to King County Superior Court, there were still ashtrays on the council table and spittoons off to the side. The spittoons were not used anymore, but the ashtrays were. And so, yes, it's been a long time. One of the things, I'm going to ask this to Jennifer Ott. One of the articles I looked at in preparation for this talked about the reaction to Brown versus Board of Education in terms of the Red Scare. Is on the liberal side, you said, hey, one of the appeals of communism is they're not treating people terribly based on race. So we have to show that we can be a real free society. And then in the South, the reaction was, no, no, no. If you take away states' rights and you do what you want to do in Brown versus Board of Education and do away with separate but equal, you're giving the communists entry into our country because we're losing the strength of state governments to this overall federal government that's telling us what we have to do, even though it's against our traditions, against our culture, and against our principles.
So it was interesting when you sent me that letter or that article, because that has a Seattle parallel. In the 20s, there were a lot of people who were joining together openly under the communist label as social justice organizations. And a lot of them were very pointedly cross-racial. And they were trying to draw people together in solidarity, and so that they could make change that would raise everyone up. And I looked everywhere for the letter in the city archives and couldn't find it, but I'll give a synopsis. Is Revels Caton, who was the son of a prominent Seattle publisher, he was a Black man, and he joined the Communist Party, as did his mother. And he also joined organizations that get banded together for unemployed citizens relief prior to the Depression, because in the 20s, there was a lot of unemployment also that really harmed working class folks. And they wrote these letters saying that it is only just and right, the equal application of the law, all the things that are the tenets of the civil rights movement. And it's interesting that as I read the letters, I was so surprised at how freely they used the Communist Party tenets, the names, all of that they brought into it. And I cringed for them, right? Just reading the historical documents, like, oh, this is going to come back and bite you, because now you have it in print in the public record that you are supporting this. But it was the idea of, if we really want to live the true values of the Constitution, there is a lot of overlap with the Communist Party, but then it would just be turned against people.
And
I wanted to say
Go ahead,
something
yeah.
about that. The Brown versus Board of Education makes me think of it, and this is something that doesn't involve a parallel to today as well. After Brown was decided, Chief Justice Earl Warren was immediately labeled as a communist sympathizer. That only got worse in 1957. On the day when the Yates case was decided, there were a half a dozen other cases decided also, which championed civil rights. That led J. Edgar Hoover to declare that Red Monday. That's what they called that day, the day on which those opinions were issued. Earl Warren was tagged as being a Soviet asset, and that the Brown versus Board of Education was there for the purpose of sowing the seeds of dissension and bringing down American society. He was then targeted with the, I grew up seeing, not a lot because I was in New England, but in other parts of the country, there were impeach Earl Warren wanted posters everywhere.
Billboards,
Bumper stickers, billboards. It was a huge thing, like we see sometimes, and this is the parallel, the targeting of a judge based on the rulings that judge has made. John Birch Society, I don't know if anybody even knows about John Birch Society anymore. They've sort of faded, but they were big at the time, conservative organization that were really the primary sponsors of the impeach Earl Warren push. The Robert Welch, the head of the John Birch Society, was on record as saying that, yeah, we don't really expect him to be impeached, but it has a good effect on him and all the other judges to know that we're out there constantly making this threat. So to me, I think that's a very significant parallel.
Yes, and there were threats to impeach certain federal judges during the Red Scare movement, even before Brown versus Board of Education, if a federal judge found free speech or free assembly under the Constitution. So this isn't the first time there's been those kinds of threats. It's the first time those kinds of threats have come from the Department of Justice or the President of the United States, and that's what makes this so different. We have about 15 minutes. We're going to go a little bit longer, and then we may take a question or two from the audience. But there's a little bit of a parallel I want to make here. The first Red Scare was, let's get rid of these immigrants, these Jews who came here from Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And they targeted people based on their immigration status or their ethnicity. The second Red Scare was totally different. These people are hiding among us. We can't tell who they are. And we need you, the public, to snitch on those people so we can root them out and prosecute them. And again, going back to our 1950s, I Led Three Lives. Remember that
Yeah,
TV
yeah.
show? That was a big TV show that we had where it was a guy who was a former communist. He had a regular family and was an upstanding citizen, but he was an operative for the FBI to root out neighbors who were talking about things like civil rights or peace or things like that. And that was a different climate for sure in those days. Jennifer, you want to talk about the difference between the targets in those two scares?
Sure, it's remarkable how stark it is when you look at the record that in the first Red Scare, the otherness is immigrants, and it's very targeted at specific groups of immigrants, specific countries of origin, and there's no, I mean, there are certainly ties that you could have argued, but there was no real foundation to it. And then you get into the post World War II era, and the idea of just looking at your neighbors, and it's chilling to think about what that must have been like to have people just watching you. You know, you have to wonder if your neighbors were just keeping an eye on you and ready to report you. And I think it might be good just to read the quick quote from the Ellis book, and then we don't have to go too deep into it, but it's such a good example of this. So we published a book a while back. It's the memoir that Jim Ellis wrote, but he wasn't able to finish it before he passed away. So we, HistoryLink, posthumously edited it and finished the last part. And as we were editing it, I came across a section that really surprised me, because if I was called a communist today, I would probably not even shirk at it, right? That's not a horrifying thing to be called in this era. But in 1958, Jim Ellis was working on his first really big public campaign to clean up Lake Washington. And it's crazy. It was basically to get the sewage out and move to the Renton Treatment Center. And the cost of it would have been $2.50 per month for each household. And people lost their minds that it was going to be a tax and Seattle was going to control everybody. A lot of the arguments you hear all the time here. But what I thought was interesting is, so Jim Ellis, for those who don't know, was a municipal bond, primarily attorney, but civic activist extraordinaire. He did a million projects. And he and his wife, Mary Lou, who was his partner in all of these efforts, he was the more front-facing person. She was the more strategist and connector. She was very good at bringing people together. And so they both went to Renton for a public meeting in support of the measure, because they needed to get all the communities around Lake Washington to vote for it. And this is just a few paragraphs, but I just want to read it because when I came across this in the manuscript, it really struck me with what it meant to be targeted like this. And so they're at this public meeting, and he says, the crowd proved to be hostile and shouted angry questions, boos and hisses. Mary Lou had not previously witnessed these attacks, and on the way home, she wondered aloud how people could get so mixed up and bitter. She also observed that my answers, which were patient and low-key, had been far more effective than the angry responses in kind. When you become defensive, you sink to the level of your attackers, she reminded me. Neither of us was prepared, however, for the next issue of Town Talk. In a front-page article, Gerard Schellen and I were accused of being part of a communist conspiracy with links reaching all the way to named people in the Kremlin. We and our 12-year-old son, Bob, brought this paper home, and I saw the word communist in print. I reacted like a gourd bull. I told Mary Lou and my friend and law partner, Edward Starren, I want to nail this lying SOB with a libel suit. Ed agreed that the article was outrageous and constituted grounds for libel. He was willing to prepare a complaint if I insisted. He pointed out, however, that the Metropolitan Press would not print a story which they knew to be false, but they would report my bringing this libel suit. The suspicions of a much larger number of people might then be aroused against me and therefore against the Metro ballot measure. Later, he called Mary Lou and urged her to talk me out of suing. After several days of unsuccessfully trying to calm me down with nobody believes these wild things, hardly anybody reads that paper, Mary Lou confronted me one evening after dinner. Do you want to win the libel suit or win the Metro election? And I said, somebody has to stop liars from lying. And she said, nobody knows who knows you believes you're a communist. Let somebody else take this man to task. Keep your eye on the ball. Don't let them sidetrack you. And so this very prominent, very middle of the road man was that worried that his name would be sullied by a pretty much kind of a crazy editor in a small town newspaper. And so it just really surprised me about what it meant to have people watching you and able to call you out like that.
Yeah, and Jim Ellis is a lawyer who anyone who knew put at the upper echelon of attorneys in ethics and in every way, shape, and form. The K&L Gates law firm used to be Preston Gates and Ellis, and he was renowned in our community, as was John Goldmark, who did file a libel lawsuit that was tried in Okanagan County in front of not that Ted Turner, but terrible Ted Turner, who was a Superior Court judge here. And coming back to Bill and me being oldies, he was still hearing cases when we started in the 1978, occasionally as a visiting judge in King County. But John Goldmark's trial was handled partially by my mentor judge here in the U.S. District Court, Bill Dwyer, and he won a clear jury verdict for being libeled by the same Canwell and others who were not just calling Goldmark a communist, but the American Civil Liberties Union are communists, and people who testified for Goldmark included Republican Slade Gorton, who knew Dwyer from the legislature, and future Superior Court judges like Bob Windsor and the like. And it was a resounding victory for John Goldmark. But there was some sort of intervening event that's made sure he didn't get the money. What was that, Judge Downey?
Times versus
New
Sullivan.
York Times versus Sullivan. That's right.
Okay, right. I mean, it's so many. The quirky thing is they're in trial on the libel suit, having been labeled a communist, and in the middle of this trial, John F. Kennedy is assassinated by a guy who is a Marxist who asks for an ACLU lawyer when he's arrested. And that
You can't make this stuff up, right? Yeah.
I mean, that's bad timing. They took a nice long recess at that time and continued in January and got the case done. But then in between the verdict and any attempts to collect on it, much less appeal, Times versus Sullivan is decided, and there's no way it can stand. So I think they made the wonderful decision. I think we're not going to retry it. We got what we want, is the victory. We got our names back, and 40,000 is 40,000. We'll leave that on the table.
Right, and it was the reputation that Goldmark wanted fixed more than the monetary damages. So the decision was made. We got the jury verdict. Did you notice also in their bill, the jury was deliberating past midnight?
Midnight. They took the verdict after midnight.
After
when they came in.
midnight, yeah.
On the fifth day of deliberation.
Yeah, would our jurors stand for that now? I don't think so. But apparently they had a jury deliberation room in the roof of the Okanagan courthouse up there. But so those of you who are looking at the clock and thinking, wow, we still have almost an hour to go, that's federal time, but that's not real time. So we only have about 5 minutes, but I did see a hand here. You want to shout out your question?
In addition to the Red Scare, or part of it, there's also the Lavender Scare
Mhm.
against LGBT people.
Right.
And side is now for fellow travelers, which was recently in Seattle Opera House. Anyway, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Lavender Scare and maybe parallels to what we're seeing now, because now it seems like we have a federal government that is, a lot more interested in LGBTQ people in public service.
Yeah, this is a question I just want to say for the audience about the Lavender Scare focused on LGBTQ people. And just for the record, let's remember it was Judge Downing who made the first ruling in the state of Washington that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional and that gay people had the right to marry. He was reversed by the state Supreme Court. And I think the justices admit that was a mistake to reverse him. It was a little bit like, okay, we were wrong, you were right, Judge Downing. But I was always so proud of my friend doing what he did. But go ahead, Judge
But
Downing.
this is what I was thinking of when I mentioned the otherness, which is an aspect of the cultural forces that were behind the Red Scare. Just anything that was could be, these days we say otherness, could be branded that way. It was, they justified it in this case by saying that these people, and this hit really hard in the State Department, which is entity I'm close to. It hit really hard there with a lot of people who were gay, who were excellent Foreign Service officers or diplomats, but the argument went, oh, well, they're subject to being blackmailed by the communists and who will make them bend to their will, and therefore we have to get them out. And so that was the ostensible justification, which is flimsy as all get out, but it was very much a part of what I see as stemming from that, that cultural phenomenon that led to the Red Scare.
Cynthia?
I have a question. You've been talking, Judge Downing, a lot about the cultural pressures to some of this in the Red Scare, and how Jennifer Otts talked about that being called a communist today doesn't really hold a lot of sway or power, bring that fear. And there are a group of us that are really interested in how do we change the culture of what's happening today when it comes to attacks on the judiciary. So maybe this is for Jennifer, but when we look at today, and 64 is that long ago, and it seems like that's when things started to wane. Do you see forces or things that happened in those times that led to the shift in culture that is no longer with us when it comes to the Red Scare that we can take as a lesson for today?
That's a hard one. So should I repeat the gist of it?
Just
Okay.
answer.
Yeah. So thinking about pressures, the thing I think of the most, it just jumps out at me, and this is a bit of a superficial answer because I'd have to think about that one actually for a while. But what I think of is that there has to be a wholesale rejection of the expectation. And I remember, this is going to sound really superficial, but watching Mad Men, and you see the life of the woman, Don Draper's wife, I can't think of her name, where she's just so rigidly confined by femininity. Yes. Betty, yes, thank you. And she's so rigidly defined by womanhood, and there is no room to be other. There is no variation. And then all of a sudden, it just clicked for me that I understood why feminists had to burn their bras. Like, I'm not really somebody that's going to go out on the street to burn my bra, but I can understand that if you are being held so rigidly to that single expectation for whatever it is defining who you are, then you do have to do something radical. And I think that is, that's the parallel I see today, is to not accept the definitions that other people want to put on others, and in order to other them.
I'm a bit Pollyanna-ish, and the answer is probably Pollyanna-ish, but I tend to think that there is not the unifying source of fear as a motivator today. And so you've got more disparate groups with whatever self-interests they may have that cause them to toe a certain line, but I don't see it as deep-seated as the legitimate fears of communist takeover and spies and all that stuff.
Well, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this year, and it's important to keep in mind that the Declaration talked about so much about equal justice and liberties, but the Constitution didn't meet those. expectations. And it took a long time, and we're still working on it. But as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I strongly believe that sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back. Sometimes it's two steps forward, one step back. But the arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. So could I have a round of applause for our panelists today?
Thank you, Judge Lasnik. Well, thank you all for coming today. I just want to point out that Jennifer Ott and I and our executive director, Johanna Hartwig, and our communications guru, I know you're here, Georgia, in the back, both from the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society. We sat down to talk about this program a year ago this month, and it took us a year to pull off. It's the blueprint for the rest of the circuit and the other 15 districts to do their own locally based Red Scare, loyalty oath kind of program. And just again, help me thank this panel for executing so brilliantly. So thank you. And thank you for being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate you. It's such a